So what is it like to have a near-death experience? When I was 36, my youngest son and I would find out it was both beautiful and terrible, and I will always call William my miracle baby, as so many strange events combined brought us back from the brink. But 4 years before this, at the start of my journey, I had a strange dream. I found myself coming down the top of a tiny planet. The sky was edged with pink and blue and green, and behind that lay a darkness of space. A luminous spirit being that I recognized as Sai Baba was waiting for me. As I floated down and landed, I wanted to run towards him, but instead he pointed me silently towards two figures some 4 meters away. There I saw 2 little boys, one a half a head taller than the other, and standing very close together. I knew immediately that I was being shown my 2 future children. I instinctively cried out, "No, please, no more children." My circumstances couldn't have been any worse. I was on my own with 7 children, 5 under the years of age. My heart, well, it was damaged from carrying twins. It had become progressively worse with 2 subsequent pregnancies. Physically, I was a shadow of my former self, troubled also by back and joint damage, but apparently unmoved by my pleas. The spirit being pointed at the boys again, and so I walked up to try to discover if I could see what they looked like. I looked into their eyes and saw only the stars behind us streaming through their eyes. Sai Baba walked slowly away, and I watched him until he became almost too small to see, and then he disappeared over the horizon. I woke up, disturbed and intrigued by this experience. Now, 4 years on, here I was, married, 35 weeks pregnant with my 9th child, and yes, I already had the first boy from that dream, Max. My husband had announced that he wanted a girl both times that I became pregnant. I had warned him not to get too hopeful, as I believed that we would be seeing 2 little boys from that vivid dream. A number of remarkable events occurred just prior to the birth of my 9th child, William. My heart trouble had become a pressing problem, and compression in my spine has led to the loss of some muscle in one leg, making walking difficult. I woken up that day feeling stressed and full of a deep sense of foreboding. In the morning, I clearly heard a voice telling me, "You must go to the hospital." But where did that voice come from? Was it my own intuition, or was it someone helping me? I didn't know, but it sounded so insistent. I felt I must act on it. The baby wasn't due for some 5 weeks now, so how was I going to get admitted to the hospital that was hours' drive away? I had no pressing reason to really go. Filled with a sense of urgency, and after some thought, I decided I would go to the hospital. I would ask help for the pain and difficulty I was experiencing with walking. So that's what I did. I insisted on being admitted for tests by a reluctant doctor. Later, when the doctor asked me what symptoms I was experiencing, I answered, "Just write down clapped out ewe." It's British Australian for a worn out sheep. That sums it up, I think. They laughed at this and ordered tests for later that day. Within an hour of admission, I was experiencing hemorrhaging. So that's why I had to go in, I thought. I sat eating lunch later that day. I was feeling more relaxed. There were no signs of other problems of early labor. Problem over? After all, I was not due to deliver the baby for 5 weeks. So there's plenty of time now. But as I looked through that large plate glass window to the sky outside, thousands of tiny stars started to rush towards me at breakneck speed. It felt exactly as if I were suddenly sitting in the cockpit of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise, hurtling through space. Just as a really bad dizzy spell, I reasoned and limped over to my bed to lie down. By now, I was struggling for breath. Not unusual, as this happened with most of my exertions now. But my peripheral vision seemed to be shutting down too. What is this? Dark clouds were gathering across my eyes. As I lay in the bed, trying to breathe, another patient approached the bed and asked for a pen. "Are you sure you haven't got one?" she continued to ask. I shook my head and gasped, No, not right now." She wandered off unconcerned, but I feared I would soon lose consciousness. Desperately, I pressed the buzzer for a nurse to come. There was no answer. The bell was dead. Eventually, with a supreme effort, and now very little sight left, I whispered to the patient in the bed next to me, "Please call a nurse." One arrived in a leisurely fashion and asked, "What seems to be the trouble?" I managed to gasp, "I can't breathe. I can't see." She looked like a gray blob surrounded by moving clouds. She remarked casually, I had that last weekend. You've probably got a middle ear infection. I was stunned by this casual diagnosis. The situation was starting to look more and more comical. So many inexplicable delays. I would have laughed out loud if I had been capable. Here I was, I thought, fighting to stay conscious and to keep breathing, and apparently it was just all so uninteresting. I tried to gasp to the nurse that my ears were fine. She then almost absent-mindedly reached out and took my pulse. Then, full of drama, she pressed my hand and cried, "Don't go anywhere, wait here," and rushed into the corridor looking for help. As apparently my pulse was over 200 and too fast to record. Ironic, really, that she would ask me to wait. I was like a beached whale, drowning in the air, and yes, definitely not going anywhere. At the precise moment that the nurse ran off into the corridor, a heart specialist, apparently not normally ever walking those corridors, appeared in front of her, and she literally crashed into him. He came into the ward and immediately recognized my symptoms of heart failure and assembled all the necessary equipment to do a rescue mission. I was told later how lucky I was. It seemed that the only other available staff in the ward to that day was an inexperienced intern. He couldn't quickly figure out what was happening. I was told that a fatal delay might have occurred had that heart specialist not be walking down that corridor at that precise moment. Suddenly, I felt a cold gel sensor pack slapped on my back and people stabbing my toes and asking me if I could feel them. But I was so cold and numb that I couldn't feel much anymore. I started drifting off, and I could only vaguely hear them now. Then I found myself floating down this long tunnel. I looked all around, and I was aware of a soft, memorizing light at the end. I wanted to rush towards it, but I found it hard to move forward, and I could only do so by forcing myself forward, kind of like half swimming and half walking. Then I heard a distant, faint voice cry out, "Sinus rhythm, collapsing, we're losing her." But I felt completely disinterested in this. I did not know who they were talking about, and I was slightly annoyed by this interruption. Now I only had eyes for that wonderful glowing light at the end of the tunnel, which seemed to hold a promise of great warmth and love unending. I felt so joyful and excited. All awareness of my body on the bed left me, and I tried for some time to reach that light. I knew absolutely that wonderful things were waiting, if I could only get to the end of that tunnel. The light grew larger, and I could see faint outlines of figures waiting, beckoning me forward. I wondered, who's waiting there? Is it angels or my loved ones? I tried harder and harder to reach the end of that tunnel. Then a very faint voice interrupted my travels with a tiny urgent baby on board and a pleading to breathe. "You must breathe." A nurse was apparently shouting loudly into my ear. This caught my attention. I stopped in the middle of the tunnel and wondered, who has a baby on board? Who should be breathing? Then I thought, perhaps it's me. Perhaps I'm pregnant, and if I am, then I must go back. And I reluctantly turned around. It was so hard to leave that wonderful promise of all-encompassing love and warmth waiting in the light, and those light-filled beings waiting there. The return back down the tunnel was brutally sudden. I came back to consciousness to experience total chaos. Doctors were shouting, and my whole body was in pain. I felt icy cold. I could see that I was indeed pregnant. My memories flooded back, and I knew I had many children and others who needed me to hold on. I fought to come back, and although my heart rhythm was unstable, I immediately went into labor. Serious-faced heart specialist told me, "You can't have that baby yet. We will deliver in 2 weeks when your heart has settled down." I didn't argue. I could see their point, but I knew from my previous 8 deliveries that this labor was not a trial run. So, being totally exhausted, I readied myself for a long night. Whether it was the right time or not, this baby was not on its way. I was informed later that day that I had flatlined for some time, and that if this episode happened at my house, keep in mind, an hour's drive away to the nearest hospital, both William and I would have died. I reflect on that urgent message in the morning. No wonder I had to get to the hospital that day. How strange. The many delays that had led to the nurse colliding with this heart specialist. I realized that I had been somewhat protected all the way through this crisis. I also felt enormous gratitude for the nurse who had shouted in my ear, because I realized I had only turned back because of her prompting. At dawn the following morning, with labor well advanced, a grim-faced team of heart specialists and surgeons gathered to deliver the baby. I was all wired up to a bank of heart monitors and had needles in my feet, arms, and hands. My heart was still racing and wobbling around. Their ominous expressions told me that they didn't have much hope for our chances under anesthesia. "Would you like to leave any messages?" I was asked. "None," I replied. My husband and children knew I loved them. I told them every day. Since seeing the two little boys standing there on that planet 4 years ago from that dream, I felt sure that William would at least survive with his brother. As the anesthetic took hold, I felt totally at peace. After all, I'd come close to that light, and it was wonderful. I had no fear of death left. William was delivered with only minor difficulties, apparently unharmed by his prenatal adventures in the Star Trek ship. Fantastic story, Selena. I do appreciate that, and it is really awesome. I always say I appreciate it. It's because I do. These stories are fantastic. I love reading them. Even though it's super late when I get to read them, I really do. And here's something I found out recently. About 60% of the people who watch these videos are not subscribed. So if you could, help me out. Go ahead and subscribe, share, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think of the story. I see Selena is rising to one of my favorites right now because it was a real ride. Until next time, live long and live strong.